Hello, you're listening to Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and I'm right here with the dad brain from beyond the stars, Michael Whitehouse. How you doing, Mike?
Greetings, everyone. I am good.
Good.
And I hope you are too. What's been happening?
I'm supposed to be in Florida right now, Mike. I don't even want to talk about it. But it's okay. We're gonna cheer ourselves up by scaring the pants off ourselves.
I'm not wearing any pants, so I don't know how that's going to work.
You're gonna scare your pants on.
Okay, fine. Good. Looking forward to it.
I don't know about you, Mike, but I'm feeling in the mood for doing an episode on an honest-to-goodness, scary, ugly, waking up at night in a cold sweat thinking about it monster.
I'm always up for that, mate.
Yeah.
Always.
So tonight, we're cracking out the time machine again. We're travelling back to the first half of the 19th century to explore the deeds, the legacy, and the identity of the fire-breathing, high-jumping, dress-slashing demonic nightmare that people called Spring-Heeled Jack. Before we begin, I will say that although this episode is not quite as grim as, for example, the Bible John ones, this case does in places require us to discuss some incidences of real-life sexual assault. Not in particularly explicit detail, but the topic will be broached. So if that's a subject that's likely to cause you unnecessary distress, feel free to, give this episode a miss. That out of the way, shall we begin?
Yes, can I interject by telling our lovely listeners that I am boiling some soup in the background. So if you hear some boiling noises, it's the soup. I'm not doing some sort of bizarre occult ritual, just boiling down some chicken bones.
Why not both?
Yes, that's it.
It's the best kind of occult ritual.
Yeah.
The kind that leaves you with dinner afterwards.
The broth one.
So, it's the evening of the 20th of February, 1838. Beginning of the second year of Queen Victoria's reign, and we're in metropolitan London, the old Ford area, in what is today part of the borough of Tower Hamlets. Now well and truly part of the inner core of East London. In 1838, however, this would have been on the very outskirts of the city. This was a small village just beginning to be consumed by the Greater London conurbation. On Bearbinder Lane, which is today known as Tredegar Road, there was, at that time, only a single residential home, Bearbinder's Cottage. A young woman named Jane Alsop lived in this lonely house, along with her father and two sisters. It's a little before 9 p.m. Outside, complete darkness has fallen on what was then a quiet, tree-lined country lane surrounded by fields. And someone is banging at the gate. Miss Alsop answers the door and is met with a man standing in the shadows. He's wearing a black hooded cape or cloak, and he's holding a bullseye lantern, which is like a lantern with a lens that directs the light. This stranger announces that he's a police constable, and he tells young Jane, "For God's sake, bring me a light, for we've caught Spring-Heeled Jack here in the lane." Now, as we shall see, in February of 1838, that was already a household name across the London area, and a name that very likely would have set Jane Alsop's heart racing just on hearing it. And spoilers, that's not because he was the Harry Styles of his day.
Ah.
I don't know if Harry Styles is even a topical reference anymore. I'm so out of touch.
Well, One Directioners are going to be after you now. That's it.
So Jane Alsop excitedly runs back inside the cottage to bring a candle to this policeman. As she hands over the candle, and the light begins to fall on the stranger's face. A quote here from her own statement given at Lambeth Street Police Office following the encounter. She hands over the candle, quote, "The instant she has done so, however, he threw off his outer garment, and applying the lighted candle to his breast, presented a most hideous and frightful appearance, and vomited forth a quantity of blue and white flame from his mouth, and his eyes resembled red balls of fire."
Alky.
Her report goes on to mention that beneath the black cloak, the man wore what Jane believed was some kind of skin-tight white oilskin suit. As Jane reeled in shock at this bizarre sight, the stranger, without saying a word, suddenly grabbed her in a headlock and began to tear her clothes, trying to literally rip the dress from her body, using either his bare hands or some kind of bladed weapon. It's not clear which, because Jane describes them simply as claws of some metallic substance. So he's got her, he's ripping at her clothes, metal talons are raking at her skin. She's struggling, she's fighting, but she can't seem to get away. Her sisters, hearing Jane's screams, rush to see what the matter is, and they witness this. They see this sinister figure attacking their sister. One of the two sisters, Mary, is so terrified by the appearance of the man that she was frozen with fear, unable to do anything to help. The other sister was able to run out and grab Jane bodily and pull her away from her attacker. But Spring-Heeled Jack doesn't give up his victim easily. It's recorded in the police report that as he tried to prevent her escaping his clutches, quote, a large quantity of her hair was torn away in his grip. The girls flee into the house and barricade themselves inside. The 18-year-old victim's dress was almost entirely torn off her, but apart from a twisted arm and some mercifully shallow scratches on her neck and shoulders, it would seem that she was relatively uninjured, physically speaking. But the ordeal wasn't entirely over. The next thing is just a small detail, but for some reason I think it's almost more chilling than the assault. The women have fended off the attacker, they've retreated inside, locked the door. For several seconds they're standing in the hall, probably looking at each other and wondering if all that really happened. And then they hear he's still out there, knocking impatiently to be let back in.
Oh, Jesus.
Wordlessly demanding to be allowed to continue his horrific assault on Jane.
Yeah, to have that if it's human, to have that mentality to not flee the scene, but to...
The fearlessness of it.
Yeah. You know you're not dealing with something with a normal criminal mindset.
Almost as if it's his right to continue to do that, almost as if he... It's weird, it's hard to explain why it's so chilling, but it really is. So they run upstairs, they open a window and they begin shouting at the top of their lungs for help. This racket is finally enough to persuade the stranger to flee, and sure enough, the women's cries were heard by patrons at the John Bull pub, some couple of 100 yards away, who rushed to the scene of the outrage. Police were quickly summoned, but the strange attacker had melted away into the night. This was one of the first officially recorded encounters with the bizarre, quasi-demonic figure known on the streets and in the penny dreadfuls and in the newspapers and eventually in the very halls of power as Spring-Heeled Jack. This was not the first encounter. It's hard to put a finger on a definitive first encounter for reasons that will become clear later on, but as we've said, Jack was already widely known and feared by people at the time of the Allsop attack, to the extent that he seemingly name-dropped his own identity. You know, when he said, we've caught Spring-Heeled Jack here in the lane. But it was one of the first to lead to an official investigation, to paint a better picture of just what we're supposed to be dealing with here. Let's take a look at some of the other encounters, some of the other reports, and some of the lore surrounding this strange and frightening figure. A writer called Elizabeth Villiers, writing in 1928, recorded an incident in her book Stand and Deliver, which, if it was a true contemporary incident, and that's a big if, given she's writing almost a century later, an incident that, if true, could represent one of the earliest encounters, at least with all of the classic features in place. The previous October, a teenage servant girl called Mary Stevens was walking back from a visit to her parents' home in Battersea. I presume it was in the evening. The accounts I could find don't explicitly say, but the details of the story would seem to suggest that it was. And her route took her along the edge of Clapham Common. Today, Clapham Common is a very well-manicured public park, but before 1878, it was largely an expanse of untended woodland and grassland, adjacent to, but not entirely enclosed within metropolitan London. It was used to graze cattle and that kind of thing. In fact, there's a very famous painting by William Turner, View on Clapham Common it's called, if anyone wants to look it up. that gives you some idea just how untamed and wooded it was prior to being converted to parkland in the 1870s. That painting was completed in 1805, but I don't think the Clapham Common of 1837 would have been that much different. There would have been people using the land, but otherwise it was still quite a wild place. And for a young girl walking along the edge of it at night, looking into the darkness from a dim, gaslit street, pretty eerie, I would have thought. So, she's walking on the edge of Clapham Common and passes by an intersecting way called, quite ominously, Michael, Cutthroat Lane.
Oh my god! What place name?
Suddenly, and I quote here from Elizabeth Villiers, to her unspeakable horror, a tall figure leapt from the darkness of the lane. It cleared the stile with a single bound and reached her side. In terror, she would have sunk to the ground, but strong arms caught her and held her prisoner. She felt a man's lips on her face. Deliberately, he kissed her. Then, with a loud laugh, let her go, and leaping extraordinarily high, vanished into the night as mysteriously as he had come. Mary's frantic screams reach witnesses quite some distance away, it would seem. A crowd of patrons from the Falcon pub set out to find the source of these blood-curdling cries that they've heard. Now, if that's supposed to be the same Falcon pub as is currently in the area, and I suspect it is given that it appears to be a very old and historic pub, that's at Clapham Junction. So a good distance from Clapham Common itself, at least as it stands today. Those must have been some screams.
Yeah.
So this crowd, they find Mary utterly panic-stricken and just freaking out in Cutthroat Lane. Some of them hunt around for her attacker, but of course he's long gone. So they take her to the home of her employer, the wealthy owner of a mansion or townhouse nearby, and slowly they manage to pry from her the details of the story. Now, it's worth mentioning that in Villiers' account of this at least, the gathered crowd initially treat Mary's story with some healthy scepticism, at least in relation to the detail of the attacker, leaping impossible distances and the more fantastical side of it.
I take it that's where he gets his name, Spring-Heeled.
Yes, exactly. They accept that she's been attacked or maybe jumped out on by some weirdo. She did confess she had a particular fear of passing Cutthroat Lane. I think those of us who live in walkable cities are familiar with some particular eerie or isolated stretch of path where we're not over the moon about walking alone at night. She seems to have felt that way about Cutthroat Lane. Can't imagine why.
I feel that way about everywhere. I do, it's just the way my mind works. Everywhere. Down every street there's the possibility for something wonderful and the possibility for something nightmarish.
It's all these stories that we read, Michael, that's the problem.
Probably. So it's your fault.
I'll take the blame for that. But they figured she was maybe just keyed up to just the right level where some prankster's been able to push her over the edge. This, of course, being the age of the hysterical woman and the swooning damsel and all of that. So that was kind of, I guess, people's expectation at the time. However, the very next night, not too far away on Streatham High Road, a quite remarkable incident took place that seemed to corroborate the tale told by Mary Stevens. Again, this is according to Elizabeth Villiers' book, so big if true. A horse-drawn carriage was making its way south down the high street when something caused the horses to bolt. This led to an accident in which both the coach driver and a footman were badly injured. Though the cause of this was unknown to the passengers and the coachman, the footman claimed to have seen what startled the horses. He described, again I read from Villiers as quoted in The Mystery of Spring-Heeled Jack by John Matthews, he claimed, a huge creature, whether man or bird or beast he could not say, leapt from the shadows on one side of the road, and springing clean across the road, which was of considerable width, and vanished over a high wall. Once again, the eyewitness was not immediately believed, but when those he told then heard of the Mary Stevens encounter the previous night and vice versa, those close to the events began to put two and two together. Now, I don't want to get too deeply bogged down in Elizabeth Villiers' stories because, as I've said, many of the Spring-Heeled Jack accounts that originate with her are not verifiable from other sources. That doesn't mean they're not true.
Did you say the publication date was 1920, did you say?
Yes, so that's not where the idea of Spring-Heeled Jack originates, but that's where this particular story originates,
Yeah.
as far as we can tell now, because there don't appear to be any earlier sources. However, doesn't mean that it's not true, because lots of the other accounts in the same book about various criminals and ne'er-do-wells and highwaymen do appear to be very accurate and well researched. So it may be that she had access to certain sources on this subject that have been lost today or haven't been unearthed since. There are also plenty of other accounts that don't originate with her, that do have, you know, more in the way of like contemporary sources backing them up, or as contemporary as we can get, like newspaper reports and things like that.
You'd have been in the prime era of the start of the English folklorist movement. She may have had access to people that had compiled the sort of oral tradition, because the interesting thing about English folklore is that it wasn't written down the way that like the Scandinavian folklores were.
Yeah.
The only reason I know a little bit about this is because, you know, I'm a big fan of M.R. James.
Yeah.
And there's a folklorist called Jacqueline Simpson. And by the way, I found out mainly about this listening to the M.R. James podcast. So
learning from a podcast.
Jacqueline Simpson, she studied M.R. James's ghost stories from a folkloric perspective, and I was listening to her in an interview, and she was talking about how there was a long period where, you know, so they weren't actually writing the folklore down. Like, you had people at English folklore studying other countries. I think it might be one of the ideas why there are big gaps in when Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. He wanted to create an English mythology. Because he felt that there really wasn't one. That
segues so perfectly into something that we're going to talk about a little bit later, so I'm glad you brought that up. To just briefly touch on one more case that Villiers brings up, that supposedly came to light following the Streatham High Street incident. The case of an elderly lady and her 2 adult sons, and their encounter with Spring-Heeled Jack. Late in the evening, this elderly lady was returning from visiting a friend in Clapham when she and her sons, who were accompanying her, were passing by the railings of a Clapham churchyard. It doesn't say which one, but looking at the maps, I think it's probably Holy Trinity Churchyard, based on where that's positioned. So they're passing the churchyard railings. She suddenly realises she's left some item at her friend's house. But okay, she's not come far, and her helpful sons volunteer to go back and collect it. They'll only be gone a couple of minutes. They leave her waiting beside the church railings. As they retraced their steps back towards the mother's friend's house, they passed by one other person. Only one. And they described this man as tall, slim-built, dressed all in black, and wearing a cape. So this man passed by them, walking, but walking very rapidly, and with purpose, in the opposite direction. So in a direction that will take them past where their mother is waiting. They get a little further on when they hear, no prizes for guessing, Michael, their mother's terrified screams. They race back up the road and find her clinging to the railings, trembling. She's scared almost out of her senses, and she's pointing into the darkness among the gravestones. She eventually explains that, quote, a black object had leapt past her, clearing the railings in a single bound to disappear into the shadows.
That's fantastic.
Isn't it great? That's why I had to include this one.
I mean, I feel sorry for the lady, but that's fantastic.
It's a great story. So immediately the boys gather some locals. They venture into the churchyard with, like, lanterns and stuff. What they find isn't Spring-Heeled Jack himself, but they find a pair of strange, deep impressions in the graveyard soil, like the imprint of someone who has dropped from a great height and landed on his feet. What's more, if this story is to be believed, the footprints were of an unusual shape. Now, the reason I wanted to mention this story, despite its questionable origins, is it has details that illustrate and tie in quite well with 2 of the main sort of currents of belief around the Spring-Heeled Jack legend. The 2 main avenues of explanation that were prevalent in the early and mid-19th century when these events were taking place. There would be at least 1 or 2 other major avenues that would be added to this later in the 20th century, but there were 2 prevalent schools of thought at the time, not including, you know, the idea that it was hysteria and superstition, which was also widely put forward even then. The first is that Jack is some supernatural, ghostly, or demonic entity, some sort of phantom. You have recurring details in a lot of these stories, like the fire breathing, the fiery red eyes, the strange headwear that in some accounts actually resembles horns. You have these incredible feats of agility, death-defying leaps between buildings, reports of him emitting an eerie glow. There's also a recurring association, as in this story, with graveyards and places of the dead. There's definitely a very macabre and sort of gothic horror element to many of the accounts. The second popular belief was that Jack was some rogue, scoundrel, an individual human villain, or an organised conspiracy of individuals who despised women and the lower classes and were setting out to terrorise them and wreak havoc across the city. Essentially the idea that Jack was, as we'd call him today, a kind of extreme IRL troll, but an ingenious one who was using like chemical compounds and magic tricks and acrobatics. And it was even commonly put forward that he'd like invented some kind of device that allowed him to jump great distances, like a literal spring heel, which of course seems to tie in with these strangely shaped footprints in the graveyard.
So he's a Victorian Iron Man, is what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, he's a Victorian Doctor Doom then, because he's using it for nefarious.
We're going to come to the comic book associations, because there's a big one. We will come to that, but I'm glad you mentioned that as well. Very, very perceptive of you, Michael.
Well, thank you.
Obviously, these imprints seem to tie in with the idea of him wearing some kind of device that allows him to jump these distances. Certainly at that time, in 1837, 1838, pretty much all of those who believed in the physical existence of Spring-Heel Jack, and that would appear to be a large number of working class folk, and a certain proportion of the educated middle and upper class Londoners as well, they all seem to have fallen into one camp or the other on this issue. Or they at least saw those as the two main possibilities. He's either something supernatural, some fiend or devil or ghost, or he's some wealthy, rakish libertine who's doing this thing for his own sick but human amusement. And these two schools of thought about the nature of Spring-Heel Jack will pop up throughout the rest of this discussion. These two ideas have shaped the structure of the debate ever since. But there are other possibilities, including some that they perhaps didn't have the right concepts and terminology to be fully expressed and developed in the early to mid-19th centuries, and rest assured, we'll get into those in good time too. While there's some uncertainty about the truth of the 1837 encounters presented in Elizabeth Villiers' book, there is an ironclad record that all but proves that these stories were already circulating, that something had already been going on for quite some time as of the beginning of 1838. On the 9th of January, at a public session presided over by the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, the Mayor himself read a letter that he had received some days earlier. The letter was anonymous and signed simply, "A resident of Peckham." It read, "It appears that some individuals of, as the writer believes, the highest ranks of life, have laid a wager with a mischievous and foolhardy companion that he durst not take upon himself the task of visiting many of the villages near London in 3 different disguises, a ghost, a bear, and a devil, and moreover that he will not enter a gentleman's gardens for the purpose of alarming the inmates of the house. The wager has, however, been accepted, and the unmanly villain has succeeded in depriving 7 ladies of their senses, 2 of whom are not likely to recover, but to become burdens to their families. At one house the man rang the bell, and on the servant coming to open the door, this worse than brute stood in no less dreadful figure than a spectre clad most perfectly. The consequence was that the poor girl immediately swooned, and has never from that moment been in her senses. For fear that your lordship exaggerates, he will refrain from mentioning other cases, if anything more melancholy than those he has already related. The affair has now been going on for some time, and strange to say, the papers are still silent on the subject. The writer has reason to believe that they have the whole story at their finger ends, but through interested motives are induced to remain silent. It is, however, high time that such a detestable nuisance should be put to a stop, and the writer feels sure that your lordship, as the Chief Magistrate of London, will take great pleasure in exerting your power to bring the villain to justice." Unfortunately, the response of the Lord Mayor, I'm sure, was not what the writer of the letter had hoped. According to the reporter who covered this for the Times, the Mayor commented that because the letter was written in very beautiful handwriting, it was probably penned by a woman who was just getting her knickers in a twist over some burglars that were targeting the area. You wouldn't get away with that one on Twitter. However, an audience member, remember this letter was read aloud at a public session, a member of the audience piped up to corroborate that yes, quote, servant girls about Kensington, Hammersmith and Ealing tell dreadful stories of this ghost or devil, and that a local blacksmith had been severely beaten and had his flesh ripped by metal claws, the same claws this fiend had supposedly used to open women's dresses from the back. In response to this enlightened and progressive mayor surmised that the writer was clearly one of these women who had been frightened out of their senses, and she was now, hysterical, raving a load of nonsense. Don't know about you, but the mayor strikes me as a bit of a patronising tosser. As much as he's wise to be somewhat sceptical of this, he comes across as a bit of an arse. But in the following days, almost as if he had said something sexist on Twitter actually, the mayor's office was hit with a deluge of letters from Londoners claiming to have had first and second hand experience of this new menace. Among these accounts were tales of women being physically wounded by Spring-Heeled Jack's metal claws as he tore at their clothes, and several recounted incidents of people, supposedly, having died following an attack. Now, it should be said, for the avoidance of doubt, I haven't been able to find anything concrete to back up these claims of people dying from a Jack attack, to coin a phrase.
You wonder how meticulous the records would be. I mean, I know that records in London go back hundreds and hundreds of years, but you just wonder with certain types of death and things like that.
Yeah.
How well recorded would some things be?
The records certainly wouldn't be as joined up as they are today, and would certainly leave gaps for these stories to really take root even if they weren't true. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The records may well be kept, and I think the Victorians were quite focused on keeping accurate records, but they were in no way as joined up and connected as they would be today. It would all have been in a filing cabinet at the back of an office somewhere in those days, and no one person would have had access to it all. So yeah, absolutely right. In terms of people, this idea of people being killed by Spring-Heeled Jack, there's not a lot in that kind of area. The closest remotely verifiable thing I could find was a case in which a young, apparently healthy woman was found having died of a heart attack in her bedroom, and in the heat of all this panic, it was rumoured in the local area that Jack had climbed in through her open window in the middle of the night and literally terrified the life out of her. Of course, there was no witnesses or anything to suggest that that's what happened. Likely it was just a tragic death and, he was on people's minds. If there was anything remotely credible pointing to someone dying following one of these attacks, I strongly suspect that would be a matter of record then, in terms of the press and things, especially given how interested the press would become in these reports. And nowadays I think that would be at the forefront of all the literature on the subject. So I think Jack killing people is pretty speculative, so do treat that idea with a pinch of salt, but it was put out there at the time.
This is really when you wish there were people meticulously recording folkloric stories, and because they have such a power to them. It's not just about these things are just made up. The fears and the terrors that people come up with reflect the mind of the time. Also, they can sometimes, as we've often said in this podcast, Martin, they lead back, there's a thread into something that actually happened. And it's just a shame that things are quite patchy in that regard.
Even if a large chunk of the correspondence that the mayor received was mere rumour and speculation, what it does at least show is that a real panic was definitely spreading across the metropolis, and that this terrifying figure, or at least the idea of this terrifying figure, had already been percolating in the public consciousness for some time, at least some weeks back into 1837, possibly longer, which I think does chime, or at least lend the slightest touch of credibility to the 1837 cases mentioned by Elizabeth Villiers in her book. Again, she doesn't give most of her sources, but I almost wonder, Mike, if she had access to and was drawing from, for example, some of those letters to Sir John Cowan, the mayor, which we don't have today. Maybe she did have access to that.
Just in the whole missing records thing, a few years ago I was trying to get records on my grandfather's military service, and I think it's after 1920 or 1923, during the Second World War, some of the records were destroyed, and so the records that went were stuff that went back to the early 20s, and so it was really difficult to get that sort of information. And that's something that you think about now. You have information is copied, it's not centralised, and yet just think how many great libraries have burned down, how many great archives have went throughout human history, And that stuff's...
How many episodes of Doctor Who have been deleted?
Tell me about it. You know, that stuff's just gone. It leaves these holes, even in recent times. It can leave these holes.
Absolutely. For the mayor's part, the volume of correspondence he received did seem to sway his opinion slightly, although he still believed the matter had been greatly exaggerated, and he certainly had no belief in any of the supposed demonic powers of Jack. He did come to believe that this was a criminal undertaking, essentially, using what he called a pantomime display to sow fear in the populace. This interest in the case, plus the increased press interest that followed it, I mean, if they weren't covering it before, they certainly were after this, led to an explosion in reports, as well as a concerted effort by police to catch the culprit. Within a couple of days, there had been a flap of sightings in the town of Richmond, about 8 miles west of central London, along with yet more unsubstantiated rumours of murder by metallic claw. Again, this prompted heightened police patrols, and as a result, the focus of activity seemed to shift once again. It seems our Jack was, to quote the Morning Chronicle newspaper on January the 10th, so closely searched after by the local police that he soon thought it prudent to quit the green lanes of that fashionable resort for the quiet and retired villages of Ham and Petersham, where in the image of an imp of the evil one, he nightly reigned supreme, and neither man, woman, nor child durst venture beyond the threshold of their domiciles without a lantern and a thick club stick. The Morning Chronicle story goes on to mention further appearances at Kingston and Hampton Court, where Springheel Jack appeared in the form of, quote, an unearthly warrior clad in armour of polished brass, with spring shoes and large claw gloves, who, whenever pursued, after frightening not only children but also those of an older growth, scaled the walls of Bushy Park and instantly vanished. There is even mention of children claiming to have seen Jack clambering the inner walls of Kensington Palace and dancing on the lawn. This article, the Morning Chronicle article, in fact, took a very sceptical position on the phenomenon, characterising it as nothing more than sheer superstitious panic. The credulous masses were working themselves into a lather over nothing and jumping at every slightly unusual thing, and the fear and confusion and folklore was all coming together to make these stories spin out of control. To be fair, I do think there was an element of that. It's pretty clear that a lot of these stories are drawing on the pre-existing local folklore, something we will discuss a wee bit further down the line. And it should be noted that when reporters followed up on some of these cases and visited the areas where they were supposed to have happened, they found lots of people with second and third hand stories, but when they tried to track down the actual victims, they found themselves passed from pillar to post and stories changed. They found that actual facts, more often than not, proved slippery and hard to pin down. One fairly amusing anecdote, reported on by the Morning Chronicle, handily illustrates how, in the panic surrounding Springheel Jack, relatively ordinary situations were often being misinterpreted as supernatural and muddying the waters. So it reads, a few nights since, as one of the police was on duty in Little Ealing Lane, he heard some person running at full speed towards him, and in a few minutes afterwards he met the son of a respectable inhabitant of Old Brentford, who, in a state of the greatest alarm, declared he had seen the ghost. The policeman, accordingly, proceeded to the spot named by the booby. It actually says the word booby. I couldn't believe it. When he found the inspector on his white horse awaiting the report of the sergeant of the section, totally unconscious of the alarm he had occasioned. So the kid had seen this inspector mounted on a horse unexpectedly in a lane and thought it was Springheel Jack. So yeah, the Chronicle's assessment of Springheel Jack was not a particularly receptive one. In fact, I didn't mention this before, but it opened with the phrase, never has credulity or superstition been more strongly exemplified. Pretty strong words. Now, I do have some agreement with the Chronicle on this, but as we'll see, I do also, nevertheless, think something interesting was going on. Something worthy of study. Not perhaps what the more sensational authors would have you believe, but before we get to that, we've got more spooky stories of Springheel Jack to get through.
Give me them. Give me all your spooky stories. The whole time I'm just imagining, you know that Lon Chaney film that was lost, London After Midnight?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are really famous stills of Lon Chaney's makeup and outfit.
Yeah.
And I think he's wearing like a top hat and a cape, and it just, throughout this I just keep thinking of Lon Chaney.
I definitely think that that's something that's tapping into the same well of London folklore that Springheel Jack also sprung from, I believe.
The whole Jack the Ripper thing as well.
That was later, but...
I know it was later, but that's what I found really interesting, was that when I used to hear about Springheel Jack, the little I know about it, I used to think it was another name for Jack the Ripper.
There is a connection. Maybe a little bit later I will explain what the connection is. So, the reports continued. The rumour mills of London were on fire. The Jane Alsop encounter, which we covered at the start of the episode, and which was the first assault truly investigated by the Metropolitan Police, not just a Keystone Cops chase like some of the others, but an actual recorded investigation with witnesses and magistrates and what have you. That took place several weeks, just under 2 months after the airing of the rumours at the Lord Mayor's meeting. This next encounter was reported just over a week after that, on the 28th of February 1838, but notably before the Alsop attack was featured in the press. It too would lead to a police investigation, and as a result it's one of the better recorded and more reliable accounts. At 8:30, a young lady named Lucy Scales was walking with her sister down a passage known as, wonderfully named I think, Michael, Green Dragon Alley.
Oh, something straight out of Harry Potter.
If you think that's good, there was a street nearby called Spread Eagle Street.
Right.
And a Spread Eagle Hotel.
Spread Eagle Jack. It's this figure running around with his legs wide open.
It's a whole other case. These two sisters were returning from the home of their brother, a butcher based in Narrow Street in the Limehouse district, not far from Canary Wharf actually. Lucy's sister was trailing a bit behind, so it was Lucy who first saw someone standing up ahead, just around a slight bend in the passageway. What happened next? I quote here from the annual register of that year. Just as she came up to the person who was enveloped in a large cloak, he spurted a quantity of blue flame right in her face, which deprived her of her sight, and so alarmed her that she instantly dropped to the ground and was seized with violent fits, which continued for several hours. Mr. Scales, the brother, was standing outside his own premises, out of sight of the women, but not so far away he couldn't hear Lucy's screams. When he hears her terrified shrieks, he runs into the alley and finds Lucy lying on the ground in the arms of his other sister, in what the register calls a fit. Now, this is a word that comes up a lot in reports of these attacks, people being sent into fits. And as a result, in later coverage, you sometimes see it written about like this was some kind of hypnotic power that he had. Like he could cause people to have epileptic seizures or something. This is just an example of how language use changes over time. Journalists back then would have more commonly written about fits in the sense of an outburst of emotion.
Right.
Rather than an actual seizure. We still say it today, we would say like a fit of laughter, a fit of crying, don't walk shite on the carpet, your mother will have a fit.
Yeah.
These women were emotionally traumatised by what happened in these attacks. So the siblings later reported the attack at Lambeth Street Police Office. Quote, she described the person to be of tall, thin, gentlemanly appearance, enveloped in a large cloak, and carried in front of his person a small lamp or bullseye similar to those in possession of the police. The individual did not utter a word, nor did he attempt to lay hands on them, but walked away in an instant. Every effort was subsequently made by the police to discover the author of these and similar outrages, and several persons were taken up and underwent lengthened examinations, but were finally set at liberty, nothing being elicited to fix the offence upon them. The similarities to the Alsop case are absolutely startling. However, in not all encounters was his appearance quite so consistent. In the months following, appearances of Springheel Jack continued apace, at least as most accounts would have it, but their geographical reach seemed to widen, extending to many of the home counties surrounding London. His wardrobe seemed to be growing as well. Sometimes he was wearing armour, sometimes a cape, sometimes he had headwear of one kind or another, sometimes he dressed like a gentleman in a suit and a top hat, sometimes he even wore animal furs. In April of that year down in Brighton, on the coast of Sussex, about 50, 60 miles south of London. A gardener and his dog were terrorised by Jack, or at least someone or something that was attributed to Spring-Heeled Jack in the local press. The man was working in the garden of a well-to-do country home on the outskirts of the town, a garden bordered by a high wall topped with broken glass, like they used to put broken glass on top of walls to stop people climbing.
That's a harsh deterrent.
I remember being a kid and there were certain walls that you knew not to climb on because when they were built they had broken bottles cemented into the top.
That's nuts.
It is nuts. So this guy's attention was drawn by an animalistic growl coming from the far side of the wall. Suddenly, Spring-Heeled Jack, or whatever the hell it was, leapt on top of the wall in the form of, quote, a bear or some other 4-footed animal, and pranced back and forth along the top of the glass-covered wall. The witness tried to set the dog on the thing. The dog took one look at it and exited stage left. Jack, if it was Jack, then jumped down from the wall and started chasing this guy around the garden before leaping back over the wall and disappearing. If we are to believe some commentators, this shows that not only can Spring-Heeled Jack breathe fire and leap covered wagons in a single bound, he's also a shapeshifter.
That explains it. Case closed, man.
I don't subscribe to that for reasons that should be pretty obvious.
Ladies and gentlemen, he has a prejudice against shapeshifters. For all the shapeshifters in our audience, I'd like to apologise. We at the Talking Till Dawn podcast.
I'm sorry, I am a shapeshiftist. As surreal as the story is, in the newspapers in question, the story originated with the Brighton Gazette, and then it was reprinted verbatim in the Times. They actually seemed weirdly to stick with the prankster theory that was predominant among the more highbrow publications. The piece ends with the wry comment, having amused himself for some time with the trembling gardener, Spring-Heeled Jack scaled the wall and made his exit. The fellow may probably amuse himself in this way once too often. Mm-hmm. The original spate of Spring-Heeled Jack encounters ran through the winter of 1837-1838 into the spring, and by the summer of 1838 it all seems to have, by and large, tapered off. That wasn't completely the end of the story, however. The name and iconography of the Spring-Heeled Jack legend branded themselves on the Victorian collective consciousness. He became a popular boogeyman in fiction and folklore. Fictionalised accounts began being published almost right away. The 1838 series Authentic Particulars of the Awful Appearance of Spring-Heeled Jack are a bit of a mystery in their own right. They're now considered lost books. The only known surviving copies were destroyed in World War II when a bomb hit the British Library. Someone must have a copy of them in a loft or something, surely.
This is exactly what I was just talking about.
Yeah.
Things being destroyed.
Yeah. Ultimately, as often happens with folk villains, Spring-Heeled Jack came to be used for the rest of the Victorian era as a bogeyman to scare children into behaving themselves, a sort of anti-Santa Claus.
I might have to try that. I might have to break out the old Eva. Listen, darling, if you don't start behaving,
Spring-Heeled Jack's going to come down the chimney and take you away.
Maybe a bit too far.
There's even some evidence of Spring-Heeled Jack being used as a generic name for the devil. In 1863, a much more famous and fantastically popular series of penny dreadfuls, Spring-Heeled Jack, the Terror of London, was published. This is where most of the famous illustrations that you'll see today online originate.
I posted one to the Facebook page today just to let people know that we were going to do and a shout out to the people on the Facebook page. But I was looking for the name of the artist so I could include it, and it just said that it was an unknown artist, but it was from the Penny Dreadfuls.
Yeah, the artist and the author are both unknown. But you can still find, it's public domain now, you can still get a hold of this. But I think it just goes to show how much staying power Jack had. 3 decades later, his name still had that kind of marketable appeal to sell as a series of boys' adventure novels, and I believe...
That's a career we'd all be proud of, man.
Oh, definitely, definitely. These books were getting reprinted into the 1900 and so on, so they certainly had staying power. And this might actually be ground zero for what some would say is the biggest influence Spring-Heeled Jack has had on our culture. An influence that lasts to this day. Once again, these novels are surprisingly not horror stories. They're more or less a series of action-adventure stories, and Jack is presented not as a monster or psychotic sex pest, but as an avenger, an anti-hero, sort of a proto-Batman.
Wow.
The Spring-Heeled Jack of this novel is an early superhero. Our hero, Jack Dacre, gets the plans for his jumping boots and other tricks from contact with Indian mystics that he met while living in India, and he uses these powers to terrorise the usurper's minions and fight crime, and also steal shit. He's a superhero kind of anti-hero. He has a bulletproof armoured costume designed to intimidate his enemies. He has strange powers. He's motivated by vengeance and a sense of justice. He even has a sidekick called Ned Chump.
Poor Ned.
There's been a lot written about the possible influence of Spring-Heeled Jack on Batman and the superhero genre in general.
Anything about the Shadow? Because that's what I thought immediately as you started talking about him as an anti-hero. And it sounded... I mean, the Shadow is one of the things that influenced Batman, the other one being Zorro. But the Shadow was, I suppose in some ways, that character was the produce of the earlier Penny Dreadfuls into the pulp era.
Yeah.
But the Shadow kind of prowling the city at night, and also having these supernatural powers, which Batman as a character, this is something that's lost in the films, but in the original comics, he's portrayed as a spectre of the night, so there is that supernatural aspect. He's trying to make criminals think that he's supernatural in a way, but the Shadow is supernatural in some way. He has those abilities.
The Spring-Heeled Jack of the Penny Dreadfuls doesn't have supernatural powers. He's more like Batman because he doesn't have supernatural powers, but again, he's trying to portray the idea that he does have supernatural powers.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been a lot written already on this. I won't get too bogged down in it here. I did feel I should mention it though. If you're interested in finding out more about this connection, there's an article on comicbookhistorians.com that goes into more depth. It's called Spring-Heeled Jack, the Original Batman by Alex Grand. It's worth a look.
I'll definitely be checking that out.
But Spring-Heeled Jack's transformation into a piece of pop folklore, and even into a semi-heroic character, didn't quite put a full stop on his real-world appearances. In the decades following his apparent retirement, there still came from time to time flurries of frightening reports of bizarre jumping fiends in far-flung parts of the British Isles, and many of these flaps were connected by word of mouth and in the press to the steel-clawed phantom that had terrorised London in 1838. There was a major outbreak of sightings in the 1840s across Northamptonshire and East Anglia, where he terrified people in the form of a great horned devil leaping out and attacking stagecoaches. In the 1850s, he was in Devon. He returned to London in the 1870s, and in this incarnation, he would also be known as the Peckham Ghost. But the MO was almost identical. He appeared rapping at window panes in the middle of the night, terrorised late night cab drivers. Again though, he seemed to make a particular focus of women and children. But in one case he apparently made the mistake of frightening a bunch of burly workmen who chased him through the back streets of Lewisham, and he was forced to make an escape by vaulting over a series of 6-foot walls. Many of those shared the stories by word of mouth, and even some in the press were firm in their belief that this was the same being that had menaced the city 40 years previous. In the opinion of the News of the World, that most trustworthy of the English gutter rags, Michael.
Definitely.
Even then,
set your watch by it.
The Peckham Ghost was referred to as Spring-Heeled Jack who terrified a past generation. In 1877, perhaps the most infamous of Jack's resurgences took place at Aldershot Garrison in Hampshire. This is an extremely important centre of power for the British Armed Forces. It's the site of a number of very important military headquarters, including the Army's Support Command. It's often referred to, even today, as the de facto home of the British Army. So for this to take place there, at the very heart of British military power, at near enough the height of the British Empire, it's quite a startling thing, I think. This is a place guarded day and night by armed patrols. It's not somewhere you'd want to be without authorization. Spring-Heeled Jack didn't slip past these sentries to get inside and scare people. No. He spent the spring and autumn of 1877 targeting and harassing these armed guards, appearing seemingly from nowhere at isolated sentry posts, slapping the unsuspecting guard on duty across the face, then made off, quote, dodging about in a fantastic fashion.
I don't know why that's funny.
It is hilarious. On at least 2 of these occasions, he did so under live gunfire, both times he was uninjured, supposedly. The Illustrated Police News said, "His method of proceeding seems to be to approach unobserved some post, then climb the sentry box, and pass his hand, which is arranged to feel as cold and clammy as that of a corpse, over the face of the sentinel. The sentries have lately been ordered to fire on the ghost and were loaded with ball, but this precaution had lately been given up. Jack pursued his old tactics on the 31st of August 1877. He managed to reach unseen the powder magazine in the North Camp. Here, having nearly frightened the sentry out of his wits by slapping his face with his death-like hand, he disappeared, hopping and bounding into the mist." In 1888 and 1904, there were separate flaps of spring-heeled Jack sightings in Liverpool, running along rooftops and causing chaos. These are sometimes referred to as the last sightings. They are not the last sightings of spring-heeled Jack. There were actually some reported cases in Scotland, Mike, long after that.
This is what I want. Hit me with it.
In December 1937, exactly 100 years after his first appearance in London, he was apparently in Campbelltown, jumping down from rooftops on Fisher Row to terrify local women into unconsciousness. Events in Campbelltown came to a head when a mob of 400 men took to the streets to hunt for the fiend. Across the North Atlantic, in Provincetown, Massachusetts, a being that came to be known locally as Black Flash terrified the inhabitants of that town. Several cases were reported to the police, all with very similar details to one another. One Marie Costa, to give just one typical example, was leapt out on while walking past the town hall that October. He didn't lay a hand upon her, thankfully, but the sight alone was bizarre enough to send Miss Costa screaming into a nearby, Mike, you'll never believe this, coffee shop. I'm not even kidding, that's what she did. Miss Costa hid in a coffee shop.
I'm assuming you have Costa coffees in America. I mean, I always hear Starbucks.
No, I think it's a British chain.
Is it a British thing? Well, for British listeners, enjoy.
The man who sprung at her had, oddly enough, silver ears, dressed all in black, and jumped like a gazelle. It's not hard to see why some people have supposed the Black Flash of Provincetown to be, if not the same individual, perhaps something of the same species as Spring-Heeled Jack. Although it should be noted that in the case of the Black Flash, local police were quite open about the fact that they believed a prankster was at work, and there were a few rather coy, cryptic comments from officers in the months after that outbreak that do seem to suggest an unnamed suspect was identified and, let's say, strongly encouraged to stop. The most recent appearance of Spring-Heeled Jack, or the most recent report of a Spring-Heeled Jack-like sighting that I can dig up, comes from Stoneleigh in Surrey, where at 10 PM on Valentine's Day 2012, a black figure was seen by multiple witnesses hurdling the central reservation of the Ewell bypass, darting in front of a taxi and scaling a 15-foot embankment in the space of a few seconds. One of the passengers in the taxi, one Scott Martin, specifically mentioned Spring-Heeled Jack in an interview with the Sutton and Croydon Guardian. He described a dark figure with no real features, but fast in movement with an ease of hurdling obstacles I've never seen. I'm not usually one to be freaked by these sightings, but the cab driver was petrified. He didn't want to drive back alone. I am honestly baffled by this sighting, and we are intrigued by it because it was so real but so strange. If it had been just a burglar, it's the fastest I've ever seen anyone run. You can also find second-hand sightings and posts on web forums claiming to have seen something similar in that area, at least until as late as 2016. So clearly, whether the Stoneleigh sighting was or wasn't Spring-Heeled Jack, what it does show is the staying power of this legend, particularly around the home counties. He still has his own little corner of the folk consciousness. He's still very much part of the folklore repertoire that people draw from when trying to make sense of certain kinds of anomalous experience.
It'll be Brian Bethel again. Remember the Black Eyed Kids? It'll be him writing about it online.
I wondered actually if they're not to undermine it or anything, but it sounds like the sort of thing like some
creepypasta, or
I was going to say like parkour guy would run out across a road in front of a taxi, but the fact that that's still in people's minds And that's something that's going to become a little bit more important as we go on. The idea that this has the ability to survive for such a long time.
One other thing that occurred to me listening to all of this is that in the Southeast Asian countries, there's
Hopping vampires.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about that, but
not really, because it's a different area of the world, and
it's not just vampires.
Mm-hmm.
There's the sort of undead in general.
Mm-hmm.
And when I've been listening to this, I've been thinking, that's quite. And I think there are accounts that slip into some fictional ghost stories that don't originate from the East, but actually originate from something in Europe.
Yeah.
Where corpses, or revenants as they used to call them back in the Middle Ages, that they, maybe because of rigor mortis or the condition of the bodies, but that they would move in this strange way. Either that or it's Oscar Pistorius. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You're right, like, the flow of ideas spreads across countries and continents, so there could well be some connection there somewhere. But that brings us up to the present, and we're still left with the question, who or what was Spring-Heeled Jack? Shall we begin with the outlandish and the speculative, Michael?
Always, let's stay there as long as we can.
So, as we've said from the very earliest encounters, one of the main thrusts of rumour has always been that Jack is a supernatural being of one kind or another, whether a ghost, a phantom, a fey being like a boggart or bogle. There's definitely an aspect of the trickster archetype to Jack, and even an outright demonic. There's definitely a lot in common between how Jack is often presented, particularly in some of the more stylised artists' impressions.
There's something goat-like about it, isn't there? Like goat-like or satyr. Or...
Yeah, exactly. But there's a mishmash of features from all of these things and more when you look at the way he's described in a lot of reports, to the point of being self-contradictory at the times, where you almost think, how did they come to the conclusion that this jumping man in a cloak at Tower Hamlets is the same thing as a bear that chases a gardener in Brighton, But when I was a wee lad scaring myself to sleep at night reading old Reader's Digest mysteries of the unexplained books or things of that ilk.
It's the Usborne ones I remember. Was it an Usborne one?
I had an Usborne one that I borrowed from a friend that mysteriously disappeared while I had it, and I'm pretty sure he thought I stole it, but I'm convinced that ghost took it.
Wait a minute. I was just about to say, have I mentioned the story about the book that I think was an Usborne ghost book that disappeared?
Yeah, I mean, it's a well-known phenomenon, Mike. You need to get with the program, mate.
No, I remember it sort of disappeared, but I think I left it in my back garden overnight, and then in the morning it was gone. Some fiendish fox did away with it, but I always remember that book.
Every time I've read about Spring-Heeled Jack, going right back to when I was a kid, I've always found myself fascinated by the third theory, a theory that wasn't even raised until the mid to late 20th century. Theory number 1 is that he's a prankster or a group of pranksters. Theory 2 is that he's some kind of magical or supernatural being or boogeyman. Theory number 3 is that Spring-Heeled Jack is a visitor from somewhere else.
Bristol.
Could Spring-Heeled Jack be an alien? I mean, the idea explains Jack's strange behaviour, his weird feats of acrobatics, with the suggestion that he's a being that originated on a high gravity world that, you might say, overpowered for manoeuvring in Earth's puny little 1G gravity well, much as astronauts from Earth were able to make great leaps and bounds when walking on the surface of the moon, a little under 20% of Earth's gravity.
A pervy alien McClawhand.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't explain why he's attacking women and tearing their clothes up. Maybe he's trying to learn about human anatomy. I don't know. Okay, that seems superficially, I don't want to say logical, but it's a vaguely coherent idea. So he's an alien from a high gravity world, he's stranded here, or he's come here intentionally. This hypothesis came, well, I mean, it didn't catch on in any widespread sort of way until 1961. What happened in 61 was a periodical called Flying Saucer Review put out an editorial request for anyone with information on possible alien encounters predating 1947. Why 1947? Well, that was the year of Kenneth Arnold's sighting of 9 unidentified objects over Mount Rainier, an event that sensationalised the Western world and first gave us the term flying saucer. It was also the year of the Roswell incident, so 1947 kind of marked year 0 for ufology in a lot of ways. It was the start of public awareness of UFO phenomena, so you can see why they would be interested in 1961 in cases that predated 1947, because if you show that people were reporting UFOs and aliens before they knew what that was even all about, you can see how that would lend credence to the idea of these things, right? So, one of the people who responded to this call in the Flying Saucer Review was a guy called John Viner. Viner came up with an article entitled The Mystery of Spring Heel Jack, slight variation on Jack's name there. This essentially retells the events of 1837 and 1838 from the angle that the mystery man is a shipwrecked extraterrestrial, or possibly ultra-terrestrial, and also kind of hints at a Men in Black-esque conspiracy where there's an underground railroad type network of contacts and safe houses in London dedicated to helping aliens get home. Were stranded spacemen really that big of a problem in Dickensian England?
I know.
It's supposed to be like a real analysis of the events, but it reads like a really bizarre spy drama. It's like something out of Doctor Who. When Jack frightened Lucy Scales in Green Dragon Alley, was he there because he was waiting to meet a contact when she unexpectedly showed up? When he appeared at the Allsop home, was he searching for a safe house? It's a really weird theory, and it's not at all what I expected it would be when I started looking into it. Viner also ties a number of other events into the Spring-Heeled Jack legend. He contends that this hidden network of contacts sent him north to Liverpool. On July the 6th, 1938, in Toxteth Park, Liverpool, an Inspector Hemmer of the Liverpool Police Force saw a huge fireball hovering in the sky, hanging motionless for several minutes before slowly descending into the park and disappearing. This, claims Viner, was Spring-Heeled Jack's rescue party. Later events, like the occurrences at Aldershot, were either Spring-Heeled Jack returning to Earth because he happened to be in the neighbourhood, except this fireball event doesn't seem to exist outside Viner's article. I don't think it will come as any great surprise for me to tell you that Viner played very fast and loose with the facts, tortuously twisted details to get them to fit what seems to me a pretty unwieldy theory. For example, what was clearly described as a bullseye lantern in several of the original encounters, an everyday object to a Victorian person, becomes a paralysing gas gun in Viner's science fiction version. Like, people would just misidentify common objects. No, they didn't see a bullseye lantern that they would otherwise have seen every day. It was actually a fucking space gun. There's just so much stuff like that. In some instances, the one I've just mentioned with the fireball, for example, he may well have made up stories from whole cloth just to fit this strange idea of him.
That sort of stuff really annoys me.
Yes!
When I was a kid, I told my friends stories about the local area, and every street corner had a different spirit or monster, or, you know, associated with it, and I used to
Weird kid, Michael.
Yeah, I was. I used to scare my friends with that sort of thing, and I understand the joy of making people think that something's real.
Yeah.
But I was a kid. Hoaxes and people just making things up. There's real anomalous things in the world. Things that we can't currently explain. And all of that gets buried as being just woo because people just make up all this other stuff. I know Spring-Heeled Jack's maybe not a great example of it because it probably isn't.
Not something supernatural, but something interesting I think that we will all get to. Viner, even with the apparent fabrications to back it up, it still manages to be a shitty story. Like, it still manages to not be that credible. You'd think if you were going to make shit up, you'd make it joined up and coherent and make a good story out of it.
Yeah.
To give an example, among the things Viner appears to have adapted to fit his own narrative is the physical appearance of Jack. He heavily played down the great variety of different appearances and outfits that we've talked about already across the different sightings. And instead he cherry-picked details from different ones that best suited his idea of an astronaut. So he took the white oilskin suit of the Allsop encounter and the ghostly suit of vintage polished brass armour that's mentioned in some of the other accounts. Clearly a different item, described very differently, and conveniently morphed these unrelated elements together to give the idea that Jack wore a glittering, skin-tight metallic suit with a light built into the chest like Iron Man again.
Yeah.
Which he didn't. He didn't. No contemporary reports come close to suggesting that. But he arrives at that by combining different conflicting accounts. And the descriptions he arrives at did not exist before Viner.
Did it have a lot of influence, his account?
Huge amount of influence. He invents details that stuck with the accounts. He invents details such as Spring-Heeled Jack having an abnormally prominent nose and animal-like ears. In all the hugely diverse eyewitness descriptions of Spring-Heeled Jack, there's nothing about this. When he is described in human terms, and not as like a ghost or a bear or a bull, he's usually said to have had the finely hewn features of a gentleman. Eyes that glow red, maybe. A couple of witnesses do mention things like that, but there's nothing about a deformed nose or ears in a quest to make him seem less human and more alien. Viner seemingly goes beyond bending the truth and into the realm of complete fabrication. Like you're saying there, man, I'm just really disillusioned by this because so many of the details I grew up hearing and reading about, details that seem to, maybe hint at an extraterrestrial origin, then that was a fascinating, formative idea for me. That can all be traced back to their origin in John Viner's article in Flying Saucer Review, and it's all crap.
Yeah, disappointing.
Viner was almost single-handedly responsible for bringing Spring-Heeled Jack back to public awareness in the 20th century. We can give him that. But the misrepresentations have tainted almost everything that was written about Jack for 50 years. Mike Dash, a Fortean researcher and historian who's written extensively on the subject, has helped to set the record straight, and it's one of the sources I've drawn upon quite heavily for this podcast. He summed the situation up by saying, "The author's inaccurate summary of Jack's appearance and abilities has influenced almost every subsequent writer on the subject, either directly or as a result of incorporation of the description into later books." And some of those later authors are not entirely blameless either. You do have to give some leeway to writers of popular compilations and stuff because they're just pulling together existing sources, but there were some, such as Peter Haining, whose book The Legend and Bizarre Crimes of Spring-Heeled Jack was the only modern volume on the subject for decades. He compounded the error by, it would seem, fabricating yet more stories and details. You could do a whole podcast just on the inaccuracies, so where the waters of history were already very cloudy on this topic, having much of its origin in rumour and superstition and confusing word-of-mouth oral narratives, those waters have been muddied even further in recent times. I mean, it's hard to prove a negative, and a bad article doesn't necessarily mean that the basic premise is wrong, but this does give me reason, or an additional reason, to at least doubt the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So much of what's been built up around that idea has been built on the very shaky foundation of Viner's work. So I don't really believe Spring-Heeled Jack was an alien. I'm sceptical too about the idea he was some sort of phantom being. The prankster idea doesn't entirely conflict with what I'm about to suggest, but let's put it to one side just for a minute. Looking at the original sources, or as close to the original sources as possible, taking a kind of sociological point of view, leads me to wonder if Spring-Heeled Jack wasn't something else. Something just as fascinating as any of those possible explanations, or I think so anyway, and something very familiar to us today. I'm suggesting that Spring-Heeled Jack is best understood as a 19th century meme, a viral phenomenon. Now, this doesn't mean the idea wasn't seeded or helped along by some real events. In fact, I believe it was. I believe a lot of the encounters were real events, in several cases real crimes. But I think the idea of Spring-Heeled Jack, or something like him, might have emerged first out of what we were talking about, the rich melting pot of folklore and urban legend that was part of the social landscape in early Victorian England. Or it may have been triggered by a relatively minor scare that really caught light and excited the public consciousness. The basic process by which this happened is one that you and I, Michael, and everyone listening to this, has seen play out time and again in our own lifetimes. And to explain this, I'm going to ask you to turn your mind back not very far, to the late summer of 2016.
Hold on.
In the late summer of 2016, reports began to appear online, initially in the form of garbled social media posts, then mainstream news stories. Reports of sinister-looking clowns lurking on the edge of forests and playgrounds, in some cases apparently trying to lure children into secluded places. You remember the clown scare, aye?
They all float down here, Georgie.
Yeah. You remember this though, yeah? Remember that?
Yeah.
This is a phenomenon that initially began, well, it began in earnest, at least, in Wisconsin in the United States. Photos of a menacing-looking clown carrying black balloons in an empty car park started circulating on Facebook on August the 1st in the town of Green Bay. People were both creeped out and intrigued, understandably. Word of mouth speculation about the clown's identity and motivation kept the ball rolling. Unconfirmed reports of secondary sightings started appearing. Local TV news jumped on it as an oddball story. Within days, there were reports of sightings of people dressed as clowns behaving in an intimidating fashion all over the world. I can't find any mention of creepy clowns in Antarctica, Michael, but apart from that...
I bet they were there.
Just no one to see them.
Apart from other clowns. Let's just start scaring each other up.
Just a wasteland of clowns. Every continent on the planet had hundreds of reports. Hundreds. Consistent details in these cases included violent threats made by clowns carrying bladed weapons, especially threats against women and children, the targeting of schools, clowns jumping out on people, attacks on moving vehicles, property damage, theft. There are even quite a considerable number of confirmed cases of physical assault, including several stabbings that landed the victim in hospital, and at least one murder. This escalated to fever pitch with rumours of a clown purge that was supposed to take place on October 31st, although thankfully there were no mass attacks. Halloween did not pass uneventfully. Among other incidents, a family from Florida were attacked, stabbed, struck with staple guns and beaten with hockey sticks by a mob of clowns, some patterned after outfits from the film The Purge.
Bastards.
It goes without saying that these were not all the work of one person, or even one organised group of people. There's also not really much of an insinuation of a supernatural element, although some cases do have echoes of that, clowns seemingly disappearing when chased and that kind of thing, certainly, but it's not at the forefront. What happened is, an idea came along that hit just the right buttons, thrilled, chilled enough people, engaged with the fears and imaginations of a broad enough cross-section of the public, seemed credible enough to lead to some genuine concern, while also being a simple enough idea that it could be conveyed and understood quickly and spread easily. It hooked into familiar cultural touchstones, like you mentioned Stephen King's It, childhood fears, and it carried an element of mystery, encouraged discussion and word-of-mouth speculation. Who are they? What's their motive? Even if it's just to say it's mass hysteria, it's pranksters, that's enough to keep it on people's lips, keep it viral. Now, this phenomenon is often referred to as a form of mass hysteria, but I would say it's something more than that. Or more than your basic mass hysteria, anyway. The most basic form of that would be, fear of whatever the idea is spreads, and there's a sort of social feedback leading to hypervigilance, neurotic misidentifications, panic, hallucination, that kind of thing. It's likely there was some element of that with the clowns, just as in the case of that frightened lad in 1838 who mistook the police inspector on horseback for Spring-Heeled Jack. But more importantly, I think, the spread of the killer clown phenomenon gave certain people with a personal interest in causing fear or disruption, whether that's just a prank dude bros, or people who get off on intimidating others, or perhaps people looking to cause more substantial harm. The killer clown panic gave them a perfect bandwagon to jump on. It gave them a persona that they could put on that immediately let them tap into an ongoing, widespread fear. And I think the Spring-Heeled Jack panic did exactly the same thing for the troublemakers of the 1830s. Of course, there was no internet then. There was no mass media. Even the print news media was relatively local in focus and tended to be pitched at an educated audience. So the outbreak was more geographically concentrated at least. But almost every other aspect, you can see a similarity with the spring-heeled jack flap of 1838. And while several of those who used the spring-heeled jack persona may have done so just for pranks and japes, in a number of cases, I'm sorry to say, Michael, I believe that it was also used as a convenient guise by men with an appetite for sexually attacking and humiliating young women.
Which did you think some people maybe actually, in the same way that you were talking about the clowns doing in 2016, that
Bingo.
That people took this story that was circulating and just kind of fed
opportunity. But
also maybe in some ways they fed into that. It might be more than just using something as a cover, but actually identifying with the story in some way.
100%, and as you say, keeping it running, keeping it going, because it's a feedback loop.
The sort of misanthropic aspect of it. There are people that feel that way.
Yeah, totally.
I should say, not everyone who feels misanthropic is going around being a bit rapey. Okay, not everyone.
So, several cases, including the Alsop attack, perhaps the best documented of all of these events actually. Some of these cases involved women having their clothes torn off and being physically attacked. Others have women being forcefully kissed or groped. On the one hand, as we've said, there were plenty of supposed attacks that journalists were suspiciously unable to trace back to an actual victim, and it's very possible that some of these were just gossip hinging on the fear of sexual assault. But even if that's true, even if that's where it got started, maybe, once it got going, I think the stories were too perfect an embodiment of a certain kind of fucked up misogynist's fantasy that certain fucked up people were tempted to turn that myth into reality, if it wasn't already. You look at the situations surrounding the attacks, you look at the fact these victims were often in fits of tears or catatonic for hours or days afterwards. It feels like there is an implicit, unspoken detail here in some of these cases. And in some cases it is more explicit. These women were groped or kissed, and even there you have to wonder, what else he did, what else is left unsaid.
That's really interesting, given the fact that, especially at that time, women were often treated as like objects and second-class citizens. It's something I've not thought of before, but you wonder if even in police reports, if they would even mention a word like rape.
So, 1830s England, polite society was already really quite repressed by our standards. The so-called Victorian morality was already well established before Victoria even took the throne. Social attitudes towards sex and whatnot originally started changing in the wake of the French Revolution. Rape in particular was probably not considered an acceptable thing for women to talk about. Where it was discussed in polite society, it might be mythologized and shrouded in euphemism. There may have been suspicion of women who reported it. There probably would have been a social stigma associated with being a victim to it, sadly. Bit of the old victim blaming. It's even hard to determine what kind of sex education young people had then. There are certainly stories of sheltered young newlyweds from that era going into the marital bed not knowing what was expected of them. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were one or two instances here where, even without costumes or stunts of any kind, the spring-heeled jack legend might have offered women who had survived rape a means by which they could comprehend and put into some acceptable context the strange and shocking experience of being molested by a stranger, and to talk about it in a way that was socially acceptable, because it's like a shared community trauma rather than some very personal one. I mean, who knows? I'm not saying that's definitely the case. That's potentially the other side of the coin, right? If there were perverts using the legend to their own ends, that would be a flip side to that coin. To come back to the previous point slightly, there actually exists a sexual practice called solyrophilia, which involves soiling or disheveling the object of one's desire. Do not look this up on Wikipedia, by the way. The picture that comes with it, not a pleasant one.
How do you spell it?
SALIROPHILIA.
Oh, dear Lord. Come on. Come on.
One common branch of this fetish is apparently arousal attained by the act of tearing someone's clothes. may or may not be relevant, but there are some parallels between the dress-ripping attacks attributed to Spring-Heeled Jack and the actions of a man known as the London Monster, who in the late 1780s randomly attacked women on the street using various sharp implements, piercing their buttocks with a knife or pointed object. In some reports, inviting them to sniff a posy, then stabbing them in the face with a needle hidden among the flowers.
When did you say that was?
1780s.
So this means within living memory. Not of now.
Yeah, but 50
years
years before Spring-Heeled Jack. So the London Monster seems to have been someone exhibiting the paraphilia known as picarism, a sexual interest in piercing other people's skin. Obviously, I don't think there's a direct connection between Jack and the London Monster, but it does make you think, could some of these attacks have been another fetishist taking advantage of the panic and taking advantage of some of the details that came along with that, or introducing their own details to it? To return to the topic of evil clowns just for a moment, I said before, evil clowns were a familiar trope in horror and folklore and sort of childhood fears. And I think that was one of the things that helped that panic spread, because people already had a shared idea of what an evil clown was from popular culture. The groundwork is already laid in your head to some extent. But, you know, in response to that, people might say, Spring-Heeled Jack is like a unique, original type of being. He just sprung up out of nowhere. There was nothing else like him before 1837. Well, that's what I thought when I started this. You're absolutely right. It is amazing how much of the rich tapestry of folklore from previous centuries has been almost forgotten today. In fact, not only does London have a long and proud tradition of urban terrors involving strange and weirdly mythologized attackers, the London Monster was just one example. There's quite a few others, including at least 2, possibly 3, whipping toms in the 15th and 16th centuries. But London and the south of England more generally also supposedly had a whole rogues gallery of street ghosts going back centuries. Many of these are closer to some of the kind of grotesques that you'd see in Ghostbusters or Beetlejuice than how most people would imagine a real ghost. Take, for example, the Hammersmith ghost, who haunted, well, Hammersmith in 1803 and 1804. Like Jack, this guy came in a number of guises. Sometimes he was a freakishly tall figure dressed in white. Sometimes he was invisible. Sometimes he had horns and bulbous glass eyes. And, like Jack, he was reputed to physically assault his victims, including an elderly lady and a pregnant woman who supposedly died of shock in the days after they were attacked. This so-called ghost was considered such a material threat that armed vigilante groups went out hunting for it. This actually led to a famous and legally influential murder case, but that's perhaps a story for another time.
I think I've actually read about that one.
There was also another ghost in Southampton that was known for making huge jumps, much like Spring-Heeled Jack, so there was absolutely precedence in the folklore of the area and worldwide.
There's something about the leaping action, and this is probably a huge leap in of itself, but there's something about that that's almost feels in some way similar to the Pied Piper of Hamelin, and just in some way, just the act of dancing, and I think as well, thinking back to some of the stained glass art and depictions within Christian traditions.
Gargoyles and grotesques and things like that.
Well, I was thinking more of the sort of image of like dancing imps and devils.
Yeah, the figure of Spring-Heeled Jack fits very neatly into a long tradition of belief in phantom attackers that stretches way back into history, right up to stuff like the Highgate Vampire in the 1970s.
Yeah, that's definitely an episode.
Oh, 100%.
Definitely an episode.
Yeah, and arguably even has echoes in the creatures of creepypastas, which, although generally treated as fiction, there are certain ones, such as Slender Man, that have crossed over somewhat even to the extent of being brought up in criminal cases.
Yeah.
And historically, I think these phantom attackers have had their myths strengthened by real bizarre crimes that are close enough to the flavour of the folklore to help build its credibility, whether that's independent maniacs like the London Monster, Whipping Tom, or folk copycatting, bandwagon jumping, or being directly influenced by the folklore. Like the Slender Man stabbing, or the killer clown attacks, or several of the Spring-Heeled Jack incidents. But Martin, stop comparing Spring-Heeled Jack to the killer clowns. Tons of those guys were identified, even arrested. Spring-Heeled Jack has never been found. Well, it turns out just exactly like the killer clown scare. Several Spring-Heeled Jacks were indeed arrested, charged, or otherwise identified. At the end of February 1838, a blacksmith by the name of James Priest was sentenced to 3 months hard labour for a crime very much in the mould of Spring-Heeled Jack. The Morning Herald on the 1st of March said, "For some time past, numerous complaints have been made to the police of Islington by respectable individuals of a fellow of frightful appearance attacking their daughters, taking indecent liberties with them, and in several instances, some young ladies have been exceedingly terrified." It goes on to say that the culprit of these crimes had, until recently, evaded capture, but that on the previous Tuesday, James Priest had sneaked up on a group of women in an Islington backstreet and, quote, acted towards them in the most disgusting manner. The women were horrified and tried to run away, but the attacker trailed them, toying with them, until the commotion drew the attention of a Constable Ray of N Division. Police then pursued this troublemaker, and there was a chase that ended in a violent confrontation, but eventually they managed to subdue the man. It was noted that he had apparently styled himself in a way that was, well, it says here in the article, most disturbing, his appearance generally deformed and calculated to excite fear in females. I'm not sure what kind of appearance would scare a female and not a male, but I think we take the point. A little lighter in tone, maybe, is the event that took place on March 17th in Kentish Town. A police constable was walking his evening beat when a citizen informed him that Spring-Heeled Jack had been sighted in the area and said, quote, his frightful leaps and hideous appearance had scared a number of women and children into fits. This is shaping up to be a classic Jack attack, right? It's got the leaps, it's got everything. So this cop, perhaps smelling a shot at glory on the wind, decides to set an ambush for the legendary fiend. This is from the Examiner, March 25th, quote, he had not long been watching before he saw the prisoner suddenly dart out of a dark lane and make towards some children, who ran away screaming at his approach. The constable found little difficulty in capturing the monster who had created so much alarm, who turned out to be the prisoner, Charles Grenville. He lived in the neighbourhood and was considered of weak mind and perfectly harmless. His face was enveloped in a huge mask painted blue and bright at the lips. Clearly that detail was added to the mask in imitation of the blue flames mentioned in some other reports.
I would not be saying anyone doing that was harmless.
Well, what I do find interesting is that this Jack was described as making frightful leaps, when in fact he was eventually shown to be just a normal man. Makes you wonder what exactly counts as a frightful leap.
2 feet.
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, does that tell us something about the role the power of suggestion might play in these events? I mean, before television, before the cinema, before all of these things, people just didn't have much excitement in their lives, and seeing someone jumping about strangely was in itself strange enough.
Yeah, it may also have been that, I don't know what sort of condition the average working person was in.
That's true.
Back then, but I'd imagine it wouldn't be great. Maybe in some ways they would be healthier than us because they would be physically active, but
yeah,
you know, they'd be worked into the ground, and people would be, maybe they wouldn't have the best nutrition at times either, so
lack of medical support.
Yeah,
and yeah,
maybe like something that we would consider to be like normal athletic ability would for some people be something out of the ordinary. I don't know.
When the magistrate, Mr. Rawlinson, demanded that Mr. Grenville explain himself before the court, he replied with a vacant smile, according to the Examiner, "Why, it was only a bit of fun, that's all. I meant no harm." I do feel a wee bit sorry for him, I have to say, but you'll be glad to hear he was sent home with a caution. Don't do it again. That was literally what he said.
That's how you deal with a Spring-Heeled Jack, ladies and gentlemen. A wee rap in the wrist, and don't you be doing that again.
It did say he was of weak mind, which I suppose is what we would probably say today with learning difficulties or something along those lines. There were so many of these though, I could go on all night. There are some quite dark and disturbing, some of them absolutely hilarious, like the one where a woman recognises the voice of her attacker as that of a local man that she knows, and she calls him out, and it ends with her chasing him down the street.
That's brilliant.
There was also a man fined £4 in Kilburn for attacking people wearing a bearded mask and a sheet.
Nice.
There's a body of evidence also suggesting that the later Spring-Heeled Jack of Aldershot was a product of squaddy pranks, much as today they might sneak into a rival barracks and glue a sex toy to someone's head or something.
Yeah.
With that first Spring-Heeled Jack flap. One person in particular who has long been connected, never definitively, but long been connected, Henry de la Poer Beresford, 3rd Marquess of Waterford.
What a name that is. Fantastic. I thought you were going to call him Leaping Larry. Larry, I know you can leap.
He was an Irish peer, allegedly known, in his younger years, for being a fucking out-of-control, arrogant, debauched, hooray Henry aristocrat with a reputation for cruel pranks and violence towards commoners.
Did the swearing come from there, Martin? You got off on passion. You got off on passion.
You swearing all night.
You fucking aristocrats.
No. Down with 1%. His nicknames included the Mad Marquis and the Marauding Marquis. Mike, this is the man for whom the phrase "paint the town red" was invented, quite literally.
Really?
He and a mob of his boozed up fox hunting cronies carried out a violent raid on the town of Melton Mowbray on the 6th of April 1837, all because they were asked to pay the toll at the town gate, the same as everyone else. There was restoration work going on at the time, and as a result, there were some pots of red paint nearby. They battered the tollkeeper and a constable who was there. They painted them red. This is the same year as the Spring-Heeled Jack sightings would later start, by the way. Then they rampaged through the town, painting doors and shop fronts red. They beat up several police officers, painted them red. They turned over caravans with people inside, painted them red.
I don't know why I'm laughing at this. I imagine this all taking place in the space of like 30 seconds.
Probably, I think it took place over a course of probably an hour or so. When police did manage to arrest one of the rioters, so a gang of police showed up and managed to arrest one of them, the Marquis led the rest of the men in storming the jail to get him out. They assaulted 2 more cops in the process, and when he sobered up, the Marquis was forced to pay for all the damages to people and property, and each rioter was fined £100 each.
That's a lot of money.
£11,000 in today's money. I think that seems surprisingly lenient for assaulting police officers and near enough destroying a town.
For going caravan tipping. I was in a caravan that nearly tipped over once.
Oh, really?
In Weems Bay, it was getting battered by the wind, and I was a kid. I always remember it, and the caravan just started moving to the side, and me and my family were all looking at each other like, what's about to happen here?
Poltergeist activity.
No one reacted. Luckily, everything was fine.
But I mean, given the fact that these guys were extremely wealthy and probably would have paid the equivalent of £11,000 in today's money just for the experience of doing that, but you know, that's the power of wealth and titles for you, I guess. But this gives you an idea of the kind of thing that the Marquis thought of as a lark. It's also widely reported that around this time in his early life, he did eventually settle down, apparently, and become a model citizen, but in his early life, and at round about the time of the Spring-Heeled Jack episode, he apparently harboured a great deal of resentment towards both police officers, as we've already seen, and women, as well as the suggestion that he may have practiced fire-spitting techniques. Now, Beresford was also a heavy gambler, so this all immediately brings to mind that letter to the mayor about the wager between those of the highest stations of life.
Right.
Could this point to Beresford being, if not the Spring-Heeled Jack, because, as we've said, there may not have been the Spring-Heeled Jack, but a major contributor to the shenanigans that were going on in 1837 and 1838? Quite possibly. Beresford had property in London. I've seen several sources that place him in London during the period of most of the early reports. Henry's name was speculatively connected with Jack in the press as early as 1838. The Australian press, bizarrely enough, the Hobart Town Courier. There was also the Reverend E.C. Brewer, an associate of Lord Waterford, who stated in 1880, after Waterford's death, he used to amuse himself by springing on travellers unawares to frighten them, and from time to time others have followed his silly example. The Reverend Brewer might have possibly given the most concise TLDR of this whole saga. But one incident that we haven't mentioned, which throws some circumstantial suspicion on Lord Waterford, is called the Ashworth encounter, which happened at number 2 Turner Street, Commercial Road. In this case, which has similarities to the Alsop incident, a young servant boy answered a knock at the door in the late evening of the 25th of February 1838, at which the visitor, quote, threw off his cloak and presented a most hideous appearance and brandished a claw-like hand or implement. The boy was able to get away and take off screaming, possibly because Jack expected a servant girl, maybe, and was taken aback. Who knows, but his screams alerted others in the household, causing the visitor to flee. Before he did so, the boy caught a glimpse of what he described as some kind of family crest and an embroidered letter W on the inside of the stranger's cloak. W for Waterford, maybe? Whether he was involved or not, I think the idea of like a mad aristocrat being behind the terror pushes the whole idea well and truly into the realm of the Gothic, and probably didn't hurt the popularity of the story. It also makes you wonder the similarities between the rather fleeting Ashworth encounter and the later, more elaborate and fearless attacks on Miss Alsop and Miss Scales. Were those 3 attacks part of a series carried out by a single perpetrator, Waterford or someone else, who got more elaborate and audacious as time went on, escalated essentially, and added new tricks to his arsenal as he went along, the flames and whatnot? I said before that we come back to the official investigation of the Alsop case towards the end, and I think here is the place to come back to that. It seems that 2 suspects were interrogated in front of magistrates, neither of whom were Lord Waterford, it should be said. The main witness, apart from the sisters, was a coach wheelwright, someone who made wheels for coaches, who was walking in another part of Bearbinder Lane when Jane Alsop was attacked. He claimed to have heard her screams while she was being attacked, and then saw 2 men fleeing the scene. The fact of there being 2 men involved actually helps resolve one of the minor secondary mysteries associated with this. What happened to the cloak Jack threw off? The witnesses said he didn't stop to collect it, but it was gone when the authorities got there.
Magic cloak.
Magic cloak. The spaceship caught it, he threw it in the air and the UFO caught it. The wheelwright testified that later in the evening he again spotted these same 2 men hanging around the streets, and they seemed to be recapping something they had been doing earlier, and he said one of them said words to the effect of, "It was rascally, I would not have done it upon any account." Then, according to the wheelwright's testimony, they spotted him and said, "There's the bastard who was in the lane." The expletive is blanked out in the true Victorian style, but we can presume it's words to that effect. It says, "There's the blank who was in the lane."
May have been turnip. Here's the turnip.
Then they pulled the wheel he was carrying off of him and said, "What have you to say to Spring Jack?" One of the men was wearing a shooting jacket made of white fustian, which could have been mistaken for the oilskin suit described in the attack. Fustian is like a fabric similar to corduroy, but not corded. So it has that kind of...
Okay, so it's not corded. I just had an image now of some guy just kicking about in an entire corded suit. I went through a cord period of my life.
What is it that Leslie Nielsen says to Ted Danson in Creepshow? The maiden fair is waiting for her knight in shining corduroy. So the white fustian shooting jacket could have been mistaken for the oilskin suit described in the attack. Afterwards, the wheelwright went to a nearby pub called Morgan's Arms, and the 2 men, who he believed were again the same 2 men, came in after him and went upstairs to the parlour. He asked the landlord their names, and the landlord identified them as a bricklayer named Payne and a carpenter named Millbank. Payne and Millbank were interrogated, but denied having anything to do with the attack, but admitted they'd been blackout drunk most of the night. However, the Alsop family did not think either of those men were the attacker, and were completely adamant that the attacker had not been drunk. Further investigation revealed a Mr. Richardson who had also seen Payne and Millbank, but also a different unknown man in a large cloak with a boy in tow. laughing and saying something about Spring-Heeled Jack being in the lane, which might lead to a possibility that the wheelwright was confused about who did and said what. Ultimately, the story formed by these accounts was so confused and confusing that no one was ultimately brought to trial. One thing that did come of the investigation, though, was that magistrates inquired with the owner of the Pavilion Theatre and Mr. Farrell as to whether it was possible for a man to eject blue flames from his mouth in the fashion described. And he explained the method used in the theatre, where a performer would use a sponge soaked in certain acids and spirits of wine and blow these vapours through a tube and ignite them, ignited perhaps with a candle held close to the face. You'll recall that's precisely what Jack did when he took the candle. And this would produce the effect described of the flames shooting from the mouth. So while we can't say for certain what happened, it certainly shows that there's nothing here that requires us to reach for a supernatural explanation. You've got a whole mess of possible Spring-Heeled Jacks in this lane. You've got potential accomplices. You've got an expert explaining how the fire breathing could have been accomplished, as well as the fact that the fire breathing wasn't reported at any of the much later accounts like Aldershot and so forth. And this would seem to imply that the fire breathing attacks, which were condensed within London and within a short space of time, were the work of one particular individual who happened to have that skill and chose to use it to add colour or terror to his attack, and maybe ride the wave of rumour and folklore that was rising up around the character. But what of the great leaps, the ability to jump 20 feet in the air, the death-defying drops? Well, here's the thing. The Alsop case, the Scales case, and most of the other well-documented encounters don't actually make reference to any unusually large leaps. In fact, there's almost a correlation. The better documented and better corroborated the cases, the less outlandish the leaping abilities. Accounts at Aldershot mention his great agility rather than leaping vast distances per se. He ducks and dives around very quickly, but no more so than a particularly agile man would. The Peckham ghost, when Spring-Heeled Jack reappeared some decades later, he vaults over 6-foot walls, yes, but he vaults. In other words, he grabs the walls and throws his legs over. Any determined person of above average fitness could do that. The more witnesses, the more documentation, the less we find an inhuman jumping ability, unfortunately. In a lot of the cases we find, at most, someone with impressive agility, acrobatic skills. Circuses existed, acrobats existed. Seeing someone perform parkour-like feats, or even feats a lot less impressive than some of today's parkour, as we've said, could well have been dazzling to people unexpectedly witnessing it outside of the expected context in the circus ring, especially if that person is dressed to startle, especially if there's a panic ongoing. And again, we saw this in the case of Charles Grenville, where witnesses actually did report the figure jumping high in the air, but it ultimately turned out to be just a physically ordinary man. To quote from the conclusion to Mike Dash's essay on the subject, Jack's strange apparel, fire-breathing, and talons could all be produced using materials and skills available in 1838. His alleged inhuman leaps, while intriguing, are not well evidenced. There is therefore no case for supposing Spring-Heeled Jack was a supernatural being, and he also says, there were possibly several Spring-Heeled Jacks at large in 1837 and 1838, some of them working in pairs or as part of larger gangs. The persons responsible for the two best known assaults, those on Jane Alsop and Lucy Scales, were probably the same as the person whose activities in 1837 inspired the Spring-Heeled Jack scare. So, yes, disappointing as it may be from a certain perspective, although I have to admit, I do think it's fascinating, I have to conclude that Spring-Heeled Jack most likely only existed as a guise that those who wished to could pull on. People who wanted to carry out pranks, to cause panic, or much, much worse in some cases. I think he was a meme that emerged possibly as a result of an initial prankster, or possibly originated on its own by several different pieces of common folklore coming together organically in the public consciousness. A persona in a similar sense that the Guy Fawkes mask from V for Vendetta became like a meme persona that people could put on to express a certain attitude and a certain commonly understood role. Yes, the Jack persona had more to do with sexual threat and nothing to do with political rebellion, but you see the parallels, right?
Yeah, you've brought it all back to clowns again with Spring-Heeled Jack.
Everything comes back to clowns. This whole thing comes back to clowns.
Clearly being an acrobat circus performer who fire breathes.
You might be listening to this and thinking this conclusion takes the dread out of the character. If he's just an idea, if he's just a mask almost, then there's nothing to be afraid of. Mike, I think the opposite is true. A man ages, weakens, dies. A monster can be slain, a demon can be exorcised. It's harder to kill an idea. They hang around. Sometimes they burn out or they're suppressed. They go away for a long time and then, out of nowhere, they resurface in a new era, a new environment in which to thrive and grow in a new way. Spring-Heeled Jack has done this a couple of times, never with quite the same level of success, I suppose you'd call it, as that first time around. But the idea's never fully gone away. We've talked about encounters as recent as the 2010s. Hell, the fact we're discussing it in such depth right now shows that it's never really died off. The masks we wear give us power, whether those are literal masks or psychological ones, or both. They give us the daring and the drive to do things that we might not otherwise have the stomach for. That mask could be the smart suit you wear going to a scary job interview. It might be the strict tone a teacher puts on when stepping in front of a class. It might be the bother boots and swaggering attitude of a football casual he affects when he's walking into a street brawl. Those masks have all become standard things in their own areas, at least in part because under selective pressure they have proved themselves to be effective at giving courage to the user and having a desired effect on the victim or the other people involved. What if there's a mask out there, not a physical mask necessarily, but an idea, a persona, already tried and tested, that could give, for example, a street sex attacker the psychological courage to commit awful acts, one adapted to strike terror and sow confusion in the victims to help the perpetrator go unidentified and unapprehended, one that's mimicable and with proven viral potential. In this age, Mike, where it seems that misogyny and just general cruelty to fellow humans is very much on the rise in certain quarters, where you have on some of the most radicalised extremes of the internet, you've got people openly advocating rape and grooming of underage girls. I would not be surprised, I would be dismayed, but not surprised, if Spring-Heeled Jack or some modern variation or counterpart made a return on a scale dwarfing the events of 1838. There's something that scares the shit out of me more than any alien or ghost. Can you imagine if the idea wasn't limited in its spread by real-life word of mouth or local newspapers, but spreading at the speed of the internet, something on the scale of the clown panic bandwagon? But instead of people waving knives around, it's thousands of psychos and creeps rushing out to indulge their worst impulses all over the world at once under one persona. There's a scary idea. I hope it never becomes anything more than that. Michael, that's Spring-Heeled Jack. Your thoughts?
Hopefully not. Hopefully not. Yeah, I absolutely agree. It is fascinating, the idea that, I think that's one interpretation of kind of meme theory, that the more speculative interpretation is that human beings are actually we're basically the medium that ideas flow through and they propagate over time and spread. That idea that an idea can have that sort of power, especially if it's got an identity attached to it, and like you say, as a sort of mask.
Yeah. That
in itself is definitely a frightening one.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fascinating. I do think it's funny when you talk about that, because you think to yourself, well, okay, if that's the case and Spring-Heeled Jack has arisen more than once because he's an idea, was that something to do with Jack the Ripper? It's the same city.
Well, Michael,
it's the same city.
One of the early letters, you know how Jack the Ripper wrote letters to the police, to newspapers? One of the early letters, there's some disagreement about whether this was one of the genuine letters or one of the prankster letters, but one of the early ones from around about the start of his rampage, he signed it Spring-Heeled Jack. So of all these psychos and creeps and weirdos who have worn the Spring-Heeled Jack persona, Jack the Ripper may well be one of those.
Yeah. And who knows when the next one will arise.
Exactly, and I think that's, I'm not saying the exact persona of Spring-Heeled Jack's going to return, but you know, if the darkest parts of humanity's impulses again arrive at a persona that has that similar impact that Spring-Heeled Jack had, it wouldn't be limited to one geographic area anymore, because we live in a connected world now. That idea could spread worldwide. It would become not just a kind of meme in the sense of an idea, it would become an internet meme. It would spread like wildfire.
Yeah, I think you can't.
So I hope it doesn't.
Definitely not. You kind of see parallels with that in some ways with, and I don't mean to demonise an entire group, but with incel culture, you know, like for people that don't know, that's like people that identify online as involuntary celibate. They don't want to be celibate, but they are. And there's a whole kind of, there's a section of them, and I'm sure it's a very small section, but who become very militant over time. And some men who have gone on to wreak havoc and in some cases even murder have been elevated as heroes within that sort of culture. So like the idea of that's something that's like spread throughout the world because everything's decentralized and people are talking about this, and you have these subcultures that group together. Could one arise around something like that? You know, it's a definitely it almost becomes a kind of new type of cult, doesn't it?
Oh yeah,
in some ways.
It's a hazy border between those two things.
Definitely, but this has been fascinating. That Spring-Heeled Jack is something that I've heard about, but as I said to you earlier on, I kind of always associated it with Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
To see that it's kind of, there is maybe a thread between them, but that this is something it's quite interesting as well. The idea that this has kind of arisen, although it's been in different places, kind of arisen in London several times, and in some cases it's been actual killers. And then in other cases, it's been just the idea of a killer. Well,
there's one possibility that Jack the Ripper may have written a letter signed Spring-Heeled Jack. There doesn't appear to be any other people who have, as far as I could see, that actually killed under the Spring-Heeled Jack name. But again, we don't know.
I don't...
There do seem to be certainly a lot of people who, even if we don't read between the lines, you know, there's a lot of cases where it's very tempting to read between the lines and say, this feels like this poor woman has been raped, or at the very least quite severely sexually assaulted. There are ones where there's not so much left to the imagination, like even the ones where we say the woman was like forcefully kissed, that's a sexual assault. So
yeah, definitely
some of the people in the Spring-Heeled Jack persona were using that persona to commit sexual assaults, you know. So yeah, it's a dark place, but you know, remember, most people are basically okay.
I think most people are good. It's fine, man. But we all have the capacity to be evil.
At the very least, most people are indifferent. They're not Spring-Heeled Jack material.
Yeah. Leaping Larry, maybe, but definitely not Spring-Heeled Jack.
Yeah.
He would just leap over your wall and look at you with menace and then leap back.
He maintains social distance.
That comment's not going to age well, hopefully.
No, it's going to age like milk.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about this, Martin.
Yes, I think the sun's coming up, Mike.
Definitely. If you want to help out the podcast, please do share Talking Till Dawn with your friends, and also, if you can, review us on your podcast app of choice. And you can also check out patreon.com/Michael Whitehouse, where we already have a number of patrons, and it's really nice to have that support for the show and the other things that we work on. So please do all of that. And, well, the sun's coming up. It's time to go.
Stay safe and well, and don't go checking your window for Spring-Heeled Jack. He's probably not there.
Probably.
Night then.